The words should have meant nothing to the dying horse. They weren't English. They weren't any language most men would recognize. But as Rooney Carter whispered them into the giant Mustang's ear, something impossible happened. The wild creature, moments before thrashing in agony, slowly lowered its massive head to the ground. The horse had been left to die in this narrow canyon, its leg twisted at an unnatural angle, white foam covering its mouth from hours of desperate, panicked struggles. No rope could hold it. No man could approach without risking their life. Yet there was Rooney, kneeling beside 2,000 pounds of pure, untamed fury, speaking words that made no sense. The Mustang's ragged breathing slowed. Its wild eyes, which had been rolling with pain and terror, focused on the weathered face above it. And then, in a movement that defied every rule about broken horses and dying animals, the giant Mustang shifted its weight and carefully, deliberately, pressed its forehead against Rooney's chest. But Rooney's hands were shaking, not from fear of the horse, from something else entirely. Something about those words he'd just spoken. Something about why he knew them at all. Because 20 years ago, someone had whispered those exact same words to him when he was the one left broken and dying. 3 days earlier, Rooney had been tracking wild horses through the Badlands when he'd heard the screaming. Not human screams, animal screams. The kind that cut through your soul and make your stomach turn inside out. He'd followed the sound through the twisting canyon walls, his mare picking her way carefully over loose rocks and dried creek beds. When he'd found the source, his breath caught in his throat. The Mustang was a giant, bigger than any wild horse he'd seen in 30 years of range work. Its coat was the color of a winter storm, dark gray with silver threads running through its mane and tail. But it was trapped, wedged tight between two jagged boulder formations. Its right foreleg bent at a sickening angle that made Rooney's own bones ache in sympathy. Blood stained the rocks where the horse had been throwing itself against the stone walls, trying to break free. Deep, ragged cuts covered its powerful shoulders and neck from the sharp edges. The animal was exhausting itself to death. And from the look of the dried blood on the ground, it had been fighting this losing battle for at least a day. Rooney dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. The Mustang's head snapped toward him, ears pinned flat against its skull, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Even injured and trapped, the horse radiated a pure, untamed power that filled the small canyon. This wasn't just any Mustang. This was a king, a stallion that had never bowed to any man. "Easy now," Rooney murmured, taking a cautious step forward. The Mustang lunged at him, ignoring the searing pain from its broken leg, snapping its massive jaws just inches from his face. Rooney jerked back, his heart pounding against his ribs. That's when he noticed something else, something that made his blood run cold. There were boot prints in the dust all around the canyon, fresh ones, and drag marks. Someone had driven this horse here. They had wedged it between these rocks deliberately. Someone had wanted it to die, slow and alone in this rocky tomb. The Mustang screamed again, a sound so raw with pain and fury that it echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Rooney looked into those wild, desperate eyes and saw something that hit him like a physical punch to the gut. He saw himself, 20 years ago, bleeding and broken and abandoned to die. And he knew right then and there he couldn't walk away. For the next 2 hours, Rooney tried everything he knew about handling wild horses. He was a patient man, known throughout the territories for his gentle hand. But this was different. He approached from different angles, speaking in low, soothing tones that usually calmed even the most spooked filly. He offered water from his canteen, holding it just out of reach, trying to build a bridge of trust. He even tried moving some of the smaller rocks that blocked the Mustang's escape route, his muscles straining against the dead weight. Nothing worked. The horse fought him at every single turn. It struck out with its good leg, a blow that would have shattered bone. It snapped at his hands whenever he got too close. Blood continued to seep from the animal's wounds, and its breathing was becoming more labored, more shallow. Rooney could see the life, the fierce, unbending spirit, slowly draining from those incredible eyes. He was failing. The horse was dying right in front of him. That's when the memory hit him. Not like a gentle wave, but like a physical blow that knocked the wind out of him. 20 years ago, he'd been pinned under his own horse after a bad fall high in the mountains. Ribs crushed, blood filling his lungs with every ragged breath. He'd been alone in the vast wilderness for 3 days, certain he was going to die. Then, an old native man had found him. A weathered figure who spoke only broken English, but who moved with a quiet, certain purpose. The old man, Cale, had knelt beside him, just as Rooney was kneeling now. And he had whispered words in a language Rooney didn't recognize. Not prayers, not songs. Just simple phrases, repeated over and over in a gentle rhythm. And somehow, impossibly, Rooney had felt his panic ease. His breathing had slowed. The crushing, suffocating terror of dying alone had lifted just enough for him to find the strength to keep fighting. Kyle had saved his life with skillful hands and herbal remedies that knit bone and staunched bleeding. But it was those whispered words that had saved his spirit first. Words, Kyle had explained later, that were passed down from his grandfather, and his grandfather before him. Generations of healers who understood a simple, powerful truth. Fear is the true enemy, the old man had told him as Rooney recovered. Fear makes the heart race too fast, makes the breathing too quick, makes the body fight itself. Calm the fear, and the body remembers how to heal. Now, looking at the terrified Mustang, Rooney understood. This horse wasn't just trapped by rocks, it was trapped by its own terror. Every thrash, every desperate lunge was making its injuries worse. The animal was literally fighting itself to death. Rooney took a deep breath. He sat down on a flat rock, just out of the Mustang's deadly range. The horse eyed him suspiciously, its flanks heaving, but it stopped thrashing. For long minutes, they simply stared at each other, man and beast, both scarred by betrayal, both abandoned by those who should have protected them. Then Rooney began to speak. He spoke the words he'd never forgotten, the phrases Cale had whispered to him in his darkest moment. They were in a tongue he didn't fully understand, but he remembered every syllable, every gentle, rolling inflection. The Mustang's ears twitched forward, its wild eyes focused on Rooney's face with a sudden, sharp intensity. The thrashing stopped completely. Rooney kept speaking, his voice barely above a whisper, pouring every ounce of calm and compassion he possessed into those ancient words. He thought of the old man who had saved him, of the grandfather who had passed down this incredible gift, of all the broken souls, man and animal, who had found peace in these simple, powerful phrases. The Mustang's breathing began to slow, to deepen. Its muscles, which had been rigid with panic and pain, started to relax. And when Rooney finally rose and took a cautious step forward, the horse didn't strike out. It didn't bare its teeth. It just watched him with something that looked impossibly like hope. Rooney knelt beside the injured animal, and as he felt the Mustang's massive head settle against his chest in a gesture of profound trust, his hands began to shake with a realization that chilled him straight to the bone. He wasn't the first person to speak these words to this horse. The response was too immediate, too specific. It wasn't just calm, it was recognition. As Rooney examined the horse's injuries more closely, running his calloused hands along the powerful neck and shoulders, he found something that confirmed his growing, terrible suspicion. Scars, old ones, long healed, forming distinctive patterns across the Mustang's hide. These weren't the random marks of a wild horse fighting off predators or scraping against rough terrain. These were deliberate, precise and methodical, the kind of marks made by men who enjoyed causing pain for its own sake. But there was something else. Hidden beneath the Mustang's thick silver-streaked mane, Rooney found a small brand mark, so old it was barely visible against the dark gray skin. It wasn't the usual sprawling ranch brand burned into the hip. This was something smaller, more personal, more sinister. The mark was weathered and scarred over, but Rooney could just make out the shape. A crescent moon with 3 small dots beneath it. His blood went cold. He knew that mark. It belonged to a man named Marcus Thornfield, a man who'd been driven out of 3 separate territories for his brutal treatment of horses. Thornfield didn't just break horses, he destroyed them. He shattered their spirit piece by piece for the pure, twisted pleasure of watching something beautiful and wild become broken and subservient. The Mustang shifted beneath Rooney's gentle touch, pressing closer as if seeking comfort from memories too painful to bear alone. This magnificent creature hadn't just been abandoned to die in this canyon. It had been tortured, broken, and then discarded by a man who viewed cruelty as an art form. "What did he do to you?" Rooney whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and pity that felt like acid in his throat. As if in answer, the Mustang lifted its head and looked pointedly toward the canyon entrance. Rooney followed the horse's gaze and felt his stomach drop. Fresh hoof prints, multiple horses moving fast, leading into the canyon. Someone was coming back. Rooney worked with a desperate urgency. He gathered his supplies and began setting the Mustang's injured leg. The break was clean, but severe. Without a proper splint, the horse would never walk again, let alone run. He tore strips from his own shirt and used broken branches from a deadfall to create a makeshift brace, his hands moving with a practiced skill that belied their trembling. The Mustang remained perfectly still during the entire procedure, as if it understood that this man was trying to help, not harm. When Rooney accidentally jarred the broken bone, sending a fresh wave of pain through the animal, the horse flinched but didn't strike out. Instead, it pressed its muzzle against his shoulder, a gesture so trusting, so forgiving, it nearly broke Rooney's heart. But the sound of approaching riders was getting closer, louder, multiple voices now, carried on the wind, rough and impatient. And Rooney recognized one of them. The recognition made his mouth go dry with a familiar, metallic taste of dread. Marcus Thornfield had come back to finish what he'd started. "Easy, boy," Rooney murmured to the Mustang, his own heart racing like a cornered rabbit's. "We're not done fighting yet." He quickly moved to clear more rocks from the narrow passage, trying to create a wider escape route. But it was hopeless. Even if he could get the Mustang free, the horse couldn't run on that freshly splinted leg. They were trapped, boxed in, and Thornfield was known for carrying a rifle and using it on anyone who interfered with his business. The voices were closer now, maybe a quarter-mile away. Rooney could make out individual words, crude jokes about the lesson they were going to teach any fool stupid enough to try and help a worthless, broken-down Mustang. But as Rooney looked into the horse's intelligent eyes, he saw something that gave him pause. This wasn't the look of a defeated animal waiting for the end. This was the look of a creature that had been reminded of what kindness felt like, a creature that had found something worth fighting for again. The Mustang struggled to its feet, favoring the injured leg, but standing tall and proud. It positioned itself between Rooney and the canyon entrance, ears forward, nostrils flared, a low growl rumbling in its massive chest. The king of the wild horses was ready for one last battle. Marcus Thornfield rode into the canyon like a man who owned everything he surveyed, including the light and the air. 3 riders flanked him, their faces hard and weathered, their hands resting casually on the handles of their sidearms. But it was Thornfield himself who commanded attention. Tall and lean, with pale, cold eyes that seemed to find a sick pleasure in other creatures' pain. "Well, well," Thornfield drawled, his voice carrying easily across the canyon floor, dripping with condescending amusement. "Looks like someone's been meddling with my property." Rooney stepped protectively in front of the Mustang, his jaw set like granite. "This horse was left to die. No law says I can't help an injured animal." Thornfield's laugh was cold and sharp, like breaking glass. "Law?" He dismounted slowly, deliberately, every movement an assertion of dominance. "Out here, friend, I am the law. And that beast behind you cost me 3 good horses and nearly killed 2 of my men trying to break it." The Mustang nickered softly, and Rooney felt the animal's warm breath against the back of his neck. Even injured and trapped, the horse was trying to protect him. It was a gesture of intelligence and loyalty that Thornfield had tried and failed to beat out of him. "Funny thing about that Mustang," Thornfield continued, circling closer like a vulture. "It belonged to an old native fellow who lived up in the mountains. Strange old coot who claimed he could talk to animals." His pale eyes glittered with a dark, predatory malice. Of course, that was before he had his unfortunate accident. The pieces fell into place in Rooney's mind like stones dropping into a deep, dark well. The old man who had saved his life 20 years ago. The one who had taught him those ancient words of comfort. Kyle. He had owned this Mustang. Thornfield hadn't just stolen and tortured the horse. He'd killed its original owner. You murdered him, Rooney said, his voice deadly quiet, all the air sucked out of the canyon. Proved a point, Thornfield shrugged, completely unconcerned. Old man thought his whispered words and gentle ways could protect him. They couldn't. He drew his pistol with a casual confidence that was more terrifying than any overt threat. Just like they can't protect you. But before Thornfield could take aim, the Mustang did something extraordinary. Despite its broken leg and weakened condition, the massive horse lunged forward, placing its body directly between the gun and Rooney. The movement sent waves of obvious, agonizing pain through the animal's body, but it held its ground, head high, ears pinned back in a final, defiant challenge. Thornfield's men shifted nervously in their saddles. They'd seen plenty of broken horses in their time, but none that would willingly take a bullet for a stranger. Stubborn as ever, Thornfield snarled, adjusting his aim from Rooney toward the Mustang's head. Should have put you down months ago. That's when Rooney made his move. He dove sideways, rolling behind a large boulder, as Thornfield's shot echoed through the canyon like a crack of doom. The bullet sparked off the rock where his head had been a split second before. The Mustang screamed, not in pain, but in pure, unadulterated fury. Even with its injured leg, the horse began advancing on Thornfield with a deadly, determined intent. The man's companions backed their own horses away quickly, their bravado evaporating in the face of 2,000 pounds of enraged Mustang. Shoot it! Thornfield yelled at his men, frantically trying to reload his single-action pistol. Shoot them both! But something had changed in the canyon. The Mustang's scream wasn't just a cry of rage, it was a call. It had echoed off the walls and carried far beyond the rocky confines of their prison. And in the distance, answering calls began to rise. Wild, fierce, and getting closer with every passing second. Rooney peered around the boulder and felt his heart leap into his throat. The Mustang hadn't been alone when Thornfield captured it. It had a herd, a family, and they were coming back for their leader. The thunder of hoofbeats began to shake the very ground beneath them all. Thornfield's face went white as he realized what was happening. His cruelty had made him enemies he'd never even considered. An entire herd of wild horses that remembered their king and had never stopped looking for him. But they were still minutes away, and Thornfield was raising his gun again, his face a mask of hate, with murder burning in his pale eyes. The thunder of approaching hooves grew louder, a deafening drumbeat of impending justice. But Thornfield's finger was already tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow as Rooney watched the man's pale eyes narrow with deadly intent. The gun barrel steadied despite the chaos building around them. Then the canyon exploded with sound and fury. 30 wild horses poured through the narrow entrance like a living avalanche, their eyes blazing with the primal rage of a herd protecting their own. They'd traveled for miles to answer their stallion's call, and absolutely nothing was going to stop them from reaching him. Thornfield's men panicked instantly. Their mounts, smelling the raw aggression of the wild herd, reared and bolted, carrying their terrified riders away from the canyon as fast as their legs could carry them. But Thornfield himself held his ground, his years of inflicting cruelty having hardened him against ordinary fear. I don't care if hell itself comes for you, he snarled at Rooney, taking final aim. You're going to... The injured Mustang struck with the speed of a coiled snake. His massive head collided with Thornfield's gun arm just as the weapon discharged, sending the bullet harmlessly into the canyon wall. The impact knocked Thornfield backward against the rocks, his pistol spinning away into the dust. But the stallion's desperate, heroic move cost him dearly. The wounded leg buckled completely under the strain. He crashed to the ground with a sound that echoed off the canyon walls like breaking timber. Blood began to seep through Rooney's makeshift bandage as the carefully set bones shifted violently out of alignment. The wild herd surrounded their fallen king, forming a protective, agitated circle that no human could breach. They nickered and whinnied in what sounded almost like mourning, their leader's pain reflecting in their own wild eyes. Thornfield struggled to his feet, his face twisted with rage and frustration. His gun lay 20 feet away, but between him and the weapon stood an impenetrable wall of angry, stomping horses. "This isn't over," he spat at Rooney, his voice venomous. "I'll be back with more men, more guns. That beast will die, and so will anyone fool enough to help it." But as he turned to leave, something stopped him cold. The injured Mustang was struggling to rise again, using every ounce of strength left in his massive frame. Blood matted his silver mane. His broken leg trembled with the effort. Yet somehow he managed to get to his feet. The stallion looked directly at Thornfield, and in that gaze was something that made even the cruel, heartless man take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defeat. It was absolute, unbreakable defiance. This horse had endured months of torture, had been driven from his herd, left to die alone in a rocky tomb, and still refused to be broken. "You can come back with 100 men," Rooney said quietly, moving to support the Mustang's weight. "But you'll never break what you couldn't break before." Thornfield's face contorted with fury, but he was outnumbered and outmatched. With a final choked curse, he mounted his waiting horse and spurred it toward the canyon entrance, fleeing the scene of his failure. As his hoofbeats faded into silence, Rooney found himself alone with the injured stallion and his protective, grieving herd. The Mustang's breathing was becoming labored again, and the blood loss from his reopened wounds was serious. But when Rooney began speaking those ancient words of comfort, his voice soft in the sudden quiet, the entire herd fell silent. They listened, heads cocked, as if they too remembered the gentle voice of their first master. For 3 days, Rooney never left the Mustang's side. The wild herd maintained their protective circle, a living wall of horseflesh. They allowed him to approach their injured leader, but they watched his every move with a cautious, unnerving intelligence. They seemed to understand that this human was different, that his hands brought healing, not harm. Rooney rebuilt the splint, using stronger branches and strips torn from his saddle leather this time. He cleaned the wounds with the last of the water from his canteen and applied poultices made from healing plants the old native man, Cale, had taught him to recognize decades ago. But most importantly, he continued speaking those gentle, whispered words whenever the Mustang's pain became too intense to bear. The horse's response never ceased to amaze him. Each time Rooney began those soft syllables, the stallion's wild eyes would focus on his face with remarkable intelligence. The labored breathing would slow, the rigid muscles would relax, and something like peace would settle over the magnificent creature. On the second night, as Rooney sat beside the resting Mustang under a blanket of brilliant stars, he began to truly understand the profound connection between this horse and the old man who had saved his own life. Kyle hadn't just owned this stallion. He had raised it from a foal, speaking to it in the ancient language of his people, creating a bond that transcended the usual relationship between human and horse, a bond of spirit. "He loved you like a son, didn't he?" Rooney whispered, running his hand along the Mustang's powerful neck. The horse lifted his great head and pressed his muzzle against Rooney's chest, the same gesture of trust and affection he must have shared with his first lost master. A silent confirmation that broke Rooney's heart all over again. By the third day, the Mustang was strong enough to stand for longer periods. The leg was healing, though Rooney knew it would never be perfect again. The stallion would always carry a slight limp, a permanent, physical reminder of Marcus Thornfield's cruelty. But his spirit, the most important part of him, remained unbroken. His dignity was fully intact. The wild herd began to grow restless. They had stayed to protect their leader, but their natural instincts called them back to the open ranges and the freedom of the windswept plains. The Mustangs sensed their need to leave, and Rooney could see the conflict in the great horse's eyes. Loyalty to his herd, warring with a newfound gratitude to the human who had shown him kindness in the face of so much cruelty. "You should go with them," Rooney said softly, his own voice catching. "You belong out there, with your own kind, running free like you were meant to." But as if in answer, the Mustang took a careful step closer to Rooney and lowered his massive head until their foreheads touched. In that simple, profound gesture was a choice, not submission born of breaking, but a partnership born of mutual respect and a shared, unspoken understanding. The herd began to move toward the canyon entrance, calling to their leader with voices that carried across the desert wind. The Mustang answered them, a deep, rumbling call, but he didn't follow. Instead, he remained beside Rooney, his decision clear and irrevocable. One by one, the wild horses passed close enough to touch their leader's muzzle with their own, a silent farewell that spoke of deep bonds and even deeper respect. Then, like ghosts, they disappeared into the vast wilderness, leaving behind their king, who had chosen a different path. As the last hoofbeats faded into silence, Rooney found himself alone with the Mustang in the peaceful canyon. The horse stood quietly beside him, no longer the desperate, pain-crazed creature he had first encountered. This was a being who had faced the worst humanity could offer and had somehow emerged with his capacity for trust still intact. But their peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of approaching riders. More than before, many more, and they were moving with a deadly purpose. Thornfield returned with 12 men this time, all armed to the teeth and ready for blood. They rode into the canyon with the cold confidence of hunters who had finally cornered their prey, spreading out to block every possible escape route. "Last chance, stranger," Thornfield called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, sharp and final. "Walk away now and you live. Stay with that cursed beast and you die with it." Rooney stood beside the Mustang, his hand resting gently on the horse's neck. The stallion was stronger now, but still favored his injured leg. Against 13 armed men, they stood no chance in a direct fight. "That horse killed my brother," Thornfield lied smoothly, his voice pitched to play to his men's sense of rough justice. "Trampled him to death while he was trying to help it. It's only right that it pays for what it did." But Rooney had spent 3 days learning to read the Mustang's every subtle response, and he felt the horse's powerful muscles tense with a surge of recognition and pure anger. This magnificent creature remembered every moment of torture, every cruel hand that had ever touched it. The stallion knew exactly what kind of man Thornfield was. "Your brother died because you sent him to break a horse that couldn't be broken," Rooney said quietly, his voice carrying in the tense silence. "And you've been trying to make every living thing you meet pay for your failure ever since." Thornfield's face darkened with a murderous rage. "Enough talk! Boys, put them both down!" The men raised their rifles, the metallic clicks of hammers being cocked echoing in the canyon. But before they could fire, the Mustang did something that defied all logic. He reared up on his hind legs, ignoring the agony from his injured limb. His massive frame was silhouetted against the canyon walls like some ancient statue of power and defiance. The sight was so magnificent, so absolutely breathtakingly fearless, that several of Thornfield's men hesitated for a fatal second. In that moment of hesitation, Rooney acted. He slapped the Mustang's flank and shouted a sharp command in the old native language, a word of speed and flight that Cale had used. The stallion understood immediately. He spun away from the gunman, landing on his good legs with surprising agility, and headed for a narrow passage that led deeper into the labyrinth of the canyon. Bullets sparked off the rocks behind them as they disappeared into the maze of stone corridors that honeycombed the canyon walls. Thornfield cursed and spurred his horse after them, his men following close behind, their blood up. But Rooney knew these canyons better than any of them. He'd spent 30 years tracking wild horses through these twisted passages, learning every hidden trail and secret path. He led the Mustang through narrow defiles that forced their pursuers to ride single file, over loose shale that sent rocks tumbling down behind them, through passages so tight that the larger horses of Thornfield's men couldn't follow. For hours, the deadly game of cat and mouse continued. Thornfield's men grew frustrated and tired, their horses lathered with sweat and stumbling on the treacherous footing. But still, they pursued, driven by their leader's obsessive, burning hatred. Finally, Rooney led the Mustang to a place he discovered years ago, a hidden box canyon with only one entrance, where an underground spring created a small, secret oasis of green grass and cool shade. It looked like a trap, a dead end. But Rooney knew something that Thornfield didn't. As their pursuers cornered them in the canyon, their triumphant shouts echoing off the walls, Rooney whispered one last time to the Mustang in the old native tongue. The horse looked at him with those incredibly intelligent eyes, nodded once as if in perfect understanding, then positioned himself between Rooney and the entrance, A final, defiant stand. Thornfield rode into the box canyon with murder in his pale eyes, certain that his long, obsessive hunt was finally over. What Thornfield didn't know about the box canyon was that centuries of flash floods had carved a narrow, hidden ledge along one wall, completely concealed behind a thick curtain of hanging vines. It was barely wide enough for a man and a horse, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. As Thornfield and his men spread out for the kill, Rooney calmly led the Mustang to the concealed passage. The horse trusted him completely now, following without hesitation, even when the path seemed to lead straight into a solid wall of rock. "There's no way out," Thornfield shouted triumphantly, raising his rifle. "End of the trail for both of—" His words cut off as he realized his targets had vanished into thin air. For a moment, the canyon was silent, except for the nervous shuffling of horses and the confused murmurs of his men. That's when they heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats echoing from high above them. The hidden ledge led all the way to the canyon rim. Rooney and the Mustang had climbed to safety while their pursuers wasted precious minutes searching the canyon floor below. Now they stood silhouetted against the vast open sky. No longer the hunted, but the hunters. The Mustang reared up one last time, his magnificent form towering against the clouds, and released a call that seemed to shake the very rocks around them. It was a sound of pure defiance, of a spirit that could not be broken no matter what cruelties were inflicted upon it. But more importantly, it was a call that carried for miles across the desert, and it was answered by 30 wild horses who had never truly abandoned their king. Thornfield's face went white as the herd poured into the box canyon from every direction, surrounding his men completely. These weren't domestic horses that could be controlled or intimidated. These were wild, powerful creatures driven by loyalty and rage, and they remembered every single injustice their leader had suffered. "Get us out of here!" one of Thornfield's men shouted in pure terror, but there was nowhere to go. The herd pressed closer, a churning sea of muscle and fury, their eyes blazing with a primitive fire. In his blind panic, Thornfield fired wildly into the air, trying to scatter the horses. The shot echoed through the canyon like thunder, but instead of frightening the herd, it enraged them further. They surged forward as one, a single unstoppable force, driving Thornfield and his men against the canyon walls. The man who had built his reputation on cruelty discovered, in that moment, what it felt like to be truly, utterly helpless. His horse bolted, carrying him out of the canyon at a dead run, while his men scattered in every direction, abandoning their weapons in their desperate flight for their lives. From his position on the rim, Rooney watched as the wild herd pursued their tormentors across the desert, driving them far beyond the territory where they would ever dare to return. Marcus Thornfield's reign of terror was over, ended not by bullets or by human violence, but by the very creatures he had tried so cruelly to destroy. 6 months later, Rooney Carter ran a small, quiet ranch in the valley below the canyons. The Mustang, healed now except for a barely noticeable limp, grazed peacefully in the green meadow beside the house. The great stallion had chosen a life of domesticity, but on his own terms. He was never saddled, never bridled, free to come and go as he pleased. Sometimes, on clear, crisp mornings, the wild herd would appear on the ridge high above the ranch. The Mustang would look up from his grazing, nicker a low greeting to his old companions, then return contentedly to the sweet grass beneath his feet. He had found something rarer and more precious than freedom. He had found home. And in the evenings, when the day's work was done, Rooney would sit beside his unlikely partner and speak the old words of comfort and peace. Not because they were needed anymore, but because they connected him to the memory of the native healer who had saved his life, and who had taught him that the gentlest strength could overcome the cruelest force. The Mustang would rest his great head against Rooney's shoulder, and both man and horse would watch the sunset paint the sky over the endless plains. Two survivors who had found healing not just from their wounds, but in each other's company. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means everything to us.